Please welcome Professor Grant and Dr. Murthy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, Dr. Surgeon General.
Well, thank you, Professor Grant. Is that what I'm going to be calling you for this
Definitely
conversation?
not. I only answer to Adam.
Okay.
Thanks, Vivek. It's great to have you here. I just have to start by embarrassing you. I remember 2021. I got COVID, and I was the first person in our household to get it. And I texted you, and you proceeded to check in with me every day for at least 2 weeks. There have to be more important things to do in your job as Surgeon General. But my family was very grateful, and I think everyone who knows you has seen you show up in that incredibly generous way. And I think I guess if we still had house calls, you would be the person we would all want to show up at our door. So I just want to start by thanking you for your kindness and your thoughtfulness.
That is so nice of you. Thank you, Adam. Thank you. No, actually, one of the things I miss in this job is actually not being able to see patients as I used to over the years. And whenever a friend calls me or a family member with a medical question, they think I'm helping them, but I actually am really hungry to actually get back into clinical medicine again. So it's always enjoyable for me and rewarding for me to be able to participate in people's care. So
I'm going to try not to make you regret that sentiment, because we all have this image now of somebody reaching out in need. Yes, I get to matter. But tell us, why are you here? How did you end up on this path?
I don't know. I was going to New York and I got off at the wrong stop.
No, not literally. I mean, how does one go from practicing medicine to being Surgeon General?
I have no idea. And I actually mean that somewhat seriously, because there's not a defined path to becoming Surgeon General. If you look at all my predecessors, they all came to the role in different ways. And for me, actually, when I was growing up, I never thought I would work in government. I never even considered the public sector as a place where I would spend time. In fact, I remember, and part of this was because I grew up with parents who were immigrants from India who were deeply suspicious of government to some extent. And they weren't suspicious in the sense that they knew government had an important role, but they always worried that it wasn't an easy place to sort of hold on to your values and to operate with integrity, given their experiences back in India. So one day when I was actually in 9th grade, I was taking a world history course in high school. And my teacher pulled me aside after school one day and she said, "Vivek, I know you really like this world history stuff. One day you should think about being Secretary of State." And I was in 9th grade at the time, super excited. I came home and told my mom, I said, Mom, Miss Bryce thinks that maybe I could be Secretary of State one day. She immediately picked up the phone, called my dad and said, "You need to come home and talk to him. He's thinking about going into politics." So that was the notion of government when I was growing up. But when I was going through training, I went into medicine. I took many detours along the way. Some detours to start a few public health nonprofit organizations with my sister. A detour to go to business school as well, which was one of the best experiences of my life, which I can talk about. Many other detours, and at the time that I was actually called about serving in government, I was practicing medicine and teaching medical students and residents. I was building a technology company with 3 friends that was focused on using the sort of learnings of social media and evolving technology to actually accelerate research in clinical trials. And I was actually building a grassroots advocacy organization to try to improve our healthcare system. Those are things I was doing all outside of government. But when July 10th, 2013, I got off a red-eye flight and was going to pick up my laundry from the dry cleaners. And I'm walking to my car, hands full of dry cleaning, and my phone rings, and it's a 202 number. And I wasn't going to pick it up, finally kept ringing. I said, let me just pick this up. And that happened to actually be this call from the White House asking me, would you be interested in being considered for the position of Surgeon General? And I thought, where is this coming from? This is completely unexpected. And I called my now wife, Alice, and I said, Alice, I just got the weirdest call. And you'll never guess what it was. And she said, was it the White House asking you to be Surgeon General? I was like, how did you know? She was like, women, we have better intuition than you do. So, but all that to say that the advocacy work that I had done, Adam, had introduced me to the world of policy and DC, to that whole environment. But still, like, I wasn't convinced government was a place where that made sense for me to work. I just didn't think it was a good fit with my personality. But the role of Surgeon General was actually quite different from all of the other roles that people had asked me about in government. And what I liked about this role is that, one, it's actually truly an independent role. Your fidelity is to science and the public interest, not to politics or party. And I remember being asked, what if you want to say something that's important for the public's health, but the White House or the president tells you not to say it? What are you going to do? I'd say it anyway, and what's the worst that could happen? You get fired, right? But it feels like, what I loved about the role was that was the guiding light, and that resonated with me. It resonated with why I went into medicine, why I was interested in public health. And in a weird way, at that time in my life, my mentors and others who were trying to help me find my way, and I was often lost, when I was, in those early stages of my career. I still haven't quite figured out what I want to do after this job, and probably won't until this job is over. But they would always tell me that, your life, your work, it just all doesn't quite fit together. It doesn't make sense. You're doing this advocacy stuff, this grassroots stuff. You're doing this, building this tech company. You're doing the clinical work, but you're not publishing enough in your academic role. Like, you just got to be doing more of that. They're like, this all just doesn't make sense. And the first time that all of those threads actually made sense was actually when I served as Surgeon General the first time in the Obama administration, because I found that all of my work in doing nonprofit stuff, in public health, served me well. The grassroots work helped me figure out how to build campaigns that would actually engage the American public. Even the tech work that I was doing, we were building a startup, and those of you who've been part of startups know that you do what needs to be done, not what's in your job description, right? And so I ended up being the UI UX guy, for the site that we were building, right? Hiring designers, critiquing sites, building wireframes, doing all of that, which I had zero skills to do, but you build the skills that you need, right? And I actually found when we were developing our opioid campaign to change prescribing practices, those skills came in handy because we didn't have the money to actually hire a whole team to do that. So it was me and one other person on the team designing the whole site. So all of these different activities made sense. And I was reminded at that time of Steve Jobs' famous 2004 commencement speech, where he says, you can't connect the dots in your life going forward. You can only connect them looking back. And that was certainly true for me.
Reminds me of a Kierkegaard line that it's a great travesty that life has to be lived forward but can only be understood backward. We would like to be able to do it the other way around. So we met about a decade ago, and I was struck by how unconventional your approach to this Surgeon General role was. I always thought of the Surgeon General as the person who tells us not to smoke. Mm-hmm. And you were starting to...
Please don't smoke.
I mean,
get that in there. Okay.
Goes without saying, but you were talking even then about mental health, about loneliness, and I think very early on it was clear that you were a holistic thinker, and you didn't see the body as fundamentally separate from the mind. But at what point did you decide this is actually part of my mantle as Surgeon General to talk about what goes on in our heads?
Well, you're right that it was something that always mattered to me. And it mattered to me for two reasons. Actually three. One is because my mother and father brought me up that way, to think holistically. They had a medical clinic in Miami, Florida when I was growing up. And I came to see, very early on, even before I really understood the science of what they were doing, that the relationships that they were building with their patients, the time they were spending with them, helping them feel seen and heard and understood, was actually just as important a part of the healing process as was their listening to the patient's lungs and palpating their abdomen and prescribing medications to them. And so that was my first clue that health and well-being are bigger than perhaps what we may read about, in a scientific textbook. But in my own life, I had also struggled at various times with my own mental health and well-being, especially as a kid, struggled with loneliness and in retrospect with symptoms of depression and anxiety. But I didn't know what they were. I didn't know what to call them. I felt a real sense of shame around it. So I was aware that component of people's lives is important. And finally, when I was practicing medicine, itself, after I became a doctor, actually even before, when I was in medical school, when I was starting to see patients, as a medical student, one thing you have a chance to do, which residents, who are postgraduate often don't as much, is you get to sit and spend more time with patients talking to them. You get to hear their stories. You get to go back day after day after day and learn more about who they are, not just what their disease is. And those conversations made it so abundantly clear to me that people are much more than their diagnosis, and that if we don't understand how they are receiving their experience emotionally as well as physically, then we're missing half of the entire human experience here, and we can't treat them as well. We can't build relationships. I saw time and time again, Adam, that that the smartest doctors in the hospital, smartest in terms of like book knowledge, in terms of memorization, in terms of their ability to make a diagnosis and figure out what the right treatment was, that when they didn't have sort of like the appreciation for somebody's mental and emotional well-being, that their help wasn't often, they weren't able to connect with the patient, and hence they couldn't deliver the full value of what they had in their heads to that patient, because people need to trust you before they're willing to put themselves in your hands. And you can only build trust by opening yourself up to the entire person, to listening to them, understanding who they are. So that was sort of my experience of medicine, actually. That's what it taught me. And when I came into the role, though, even with all of that, Adam, I will say that the thing that finally made it clear to me that we have to take this broader approach in the role as Surgeon General was this listening tour that I did in the very beginning of my first tenure. And it was, I had a lot of time to think about what I wanted to do. And when I was Surgeon General, because I had a very long confirmation process, it was a 13-month long confirmation process. And there were all kinds of fun and exciting reasons why it took so long, which Adam knows about. It's because I had made what was perceived at that time to be a audacious and outlandish statement, which was that gun violence was a public health issue. And that seemed to draw the ire of many people, who then ultimately, it led to political challenges. But and they asked me, do you want to change your point of view on that? I was like, no, it's like pretty obvious. It's a public health issue. People are dying in large numbers for preventable causes. That's like almost by definition a public health issue. So anyhow, but during that time, like when I then finally was confirmed and started the job, I remember my strong urge was like, the communications team member from the department came in and said, okay, tomorrow, let's get you on Good Morning America, on the Today Show, and all the big shows, and have you talk about your agenda for the country. And I just, after this whole bruising process, I was like, I don't want to talk. I just want to listen for a while. So they thought I was nuts, but I was like, let's just spend the next 2 weeks traveling around the country and asking people a simple question, which is, what can we do to help? And it was in those conversations that I learned so much, that I heard not just about people's concern about obesity and diabetes and heart disease and cancer, but I also heard from moms and dads who were looking at their kids struggling with depression and anxiety and were unsure what to do. I heard from teachers who were seeing their kids taking their own lives at alarming rates that they had never seen before and were unsure what was going on. I heard from college students and graduate students who are on campuses surrounded by thousands of other students, yet they said they felt profoundly alone because nobody understood them. They didn't feel comfortable with being themselves around other people, and so they felt isolated and alone. When I heard that time and time again in big cities, small towns all across America, that's what really made it super clear to me that we've got to do something to address the broader mental health issues that people are dealing with, while we also address some of the other challenges like e-cigarettes and the other public health issues that we focused on.
Well, let's talk about some of what you've learned over the last decade then. So you've talked about loneliness being also a major public health problem. Would love to talk about, I think, a little bit about what causes it, but especially how to solve it. So I know you've been thinking a lot about individual solutions, about community solutions, about policy solutions as well. So let's look at this at multiple levels. We are here to talk connections at Wharton. I imagine some of you are here because you thought the Surgeon General is the person who can tell you how to build a stronger community here at Wharton. So this is your chance. Tell us how.
So yeah, there are a lot of ways we can do this. If you're okay with it, Adam, I'd love to maybe just talk about why this is a problem. And a lot of people think about loneliness and think, hey, it's just a bad feeling. What's the big deal? It turns out it's a much bigger deal than many of us thought. That people who struggle with loneliness and isolation are actually a greater risk for depression, anxiety, and suicide. But it also turns out, even more surprisingly, that they're a greater risk for physical illness as well. So we're talking 29% increase in the risk of heart disease, 31% increase in the risk of stroke, 50% increase in the risk of dementia among older people, and an increased overall mortality with loneliness and isolation that are comparable to the mortality impact we see of smoking daily, even greater than the mortality impact we see with obesity. And there are biological reasons as to why this is, but this is why actually it's a profound public health challenge and not just a bad feeling. It's also extraordinarily common. So I'm curious, just by show of hands, like how many people here know somebody in your life who is struggling with loneliness or isolation? So almost everyone. I should have asked how many don't know anyone. Probably would have been more instructive. But this is, every place I go, Adam, when I ask audiences this is the same response. Almost every hand goes up in the room. And this is when we released the Surgeon General's advisory on this topic last year. We noted that 1 in 2 adults in America are living with measurable levels of loneliness, but the numbers are actually much higher among young people, where they can range anywhere from 60 to 70%, in some cases even higher. So what do we do about it? Well, this is the good news, is that there is actually a lot we can do about it. And we don't need to actually wait for an act of Congress to actually take action in our lives and build greater connection, which, thank God, is the case, because those actions take a long time. And I think it's worth thinking about this on an individual as well as a community level, what we can do. So if we think about Wharton, okay, since you mentioned, since we're here and universities are places which have often in their vision the notion of creating a community, of shared learning, of mutual support. The challenge I think that we have, especially after COVID, is that our social muscle weakened a lot. And I use that term very intentionally, social muscle, because like any other muscle, it gets stronger when we use it more, it gets weaker when we don't use it. And if you've ever been on a gym routine and have fallen off the wagon, you know that trying to get back to the gym, sometimes it's just a lot of inertia, right? And the first time you go and lift the same weights that you had been lifting consistently for the past year, first time you try to do it again, it feels heavier, it feels harder, right? Running on that treadmill feels like, oh my God, I'm winded so much more easily. But that doesn't dissuade us, right? We know if we keep going back, then we'll feel better. That seems obvious, but it's not always so obvious on the social front. Many people have told me after the pandemic, especially the worst of the pandemic in the first year or so, they said, I don't know, I want to come back, but it feels a little weird to come back. I feel uncomfortable like being in these big groups. I'm not sure what to say to people. And I try to reassure them that that's okay. That's actually normal. That's all of us working out, our social muscle once again after a long time, clearing the cobwebs, and it will get easier each time we do it. I think in this setting, it becomes especially important to have spaces, times, and a bit of structure that allow people to get to know one another. If you just throw a bunch of people together in a room and hope that through Brownian motion, like connections will be made, some people will connect, but many people actually won't, especially, with this weakened social muscle we're dealing with. So that's actually why sometimes we need a little bit of structure to allow people to start the process of sharing their stories with one another. I'll give you a simple example that we use in our office, actually. This is something that we call the Humans of OSG exercise, which is Office of the Surgeon General, but it's very simple. It's like disarmingly simple, and it takes 10 minutes once a week. So this is not a massive investment of time. It also takes exactly $0 to implement, so the price is right, right? But when you think about this, it involves, during our all-staff meeting, choosing 2 people, right? And so let's just say Adam and I were the 2 people that were chosen. And in that, we would say you both have 10 minutes, and we want one of you to interview the other, just about your life. Anything is fair play as long as it's not about your current job. So in those conversations, people ask all kinds of things. They might ask, hey, what did you dream of doing, like when you were a kid? Who'd you trust? Who'd you look up to when you were a kid? Where'd you think you would live? What are things you do now when you're feeling stressed out? Or worried about something, like who are the people you look to now? Who are your role models? What's your favorite music? Whatever it might be. We learn about the human being that's been on our team, sometimes for a long time, but we knew their skill sets, but we didn't know their humanity. But what is really striking to me is how we are so hardwired for connection that sometimes just a little bit of truly human interaction, of learning somebody's story, hearing about their life, a little bit of honest sharing can help forge really strong connections. And so we can build those through simple activities like that. I'll ask you just say on a personal level, in terms of what you can do in your own life. Here, there's a lot, and it's actually, again, disarmingly simple. I'll tell you a few of the things that I like to do, some of my favorite go-tos. One is I like to, and I say this as somebody who's actually lived through many periods of my life struggling with loneliness and isolation. And I'll tell you about one of those periods in a bit, but I find that simply just taking 10 to 15 minutes a day to talk to somebody you care about, whether it's in person or on the phone or through a video conference, makes a huge difference. It can just be a call to check on them. You don't need to have an agenda. You don't have to doesn't have to be any planning involved. It could just be like me calling Adam and say, hey, Adam, I'm just on the way to work. What's going on? What are you doing? What did you do yesterday? Did you catch the Sixers game? Were you upset about the no calls at the end? What's going on? It could just be a simple, I was upset about that, but anyway. It could be something very simple like that. So 15 minutes a day to connect with someone you care about. The second thing is to make sure when you're connecting with somebody in those 15 minutes, that you're actually giving them your full attention. Sounds simple, super hard, right? How many times have we been in conversation, as I have been, when you're talking to somebody and then somehow your hand slips into your pocket, somehow your phone comes out, somehow if you're me, you're on ESPN.com checking the scores, you're looking at your inbox, you're looking at the news, like something's going on, and then 15 minutes later, you're like, wait, I don't need to do this. And I remember the content of what they said, but I don't really process what they were saying. And we think, oh, I remember the words, so I got the conversation. That is not the case, right? Words that people speak are only one portion of how they communicate. It's this moments of silence. It's a nuance. It's a body language. It's a facial expression. All of that feeds into how connected we feel to somebody else. So that's the second thing I do, is to make sure that in those 15 minutes, I'm giving them my full attention. The third thing I do, and this is going to make me seem super old, but I actually call people on the phone, and I pick up the phone when they call. And that is revolutionary. It's like a big deal. But it doesn't happen very often these days. Picking up a phone call is the equivalent of getting snail mail from somebody you know, right? It's like, wow, this doesn't happen, but it's kind of neat when it does. And I found that if I have the option, like let's say I'm walking into this talk with Adam, and somebody calls, right, like 2 minutes before I'm supposed to roll in, I have two options. I could silence it and say I'll call him later, and maybe I text him and say, hey, I'm in the middle of something, I'll chat with you later. Or I can literally spend the same exact amount of time, pick up the phone and say, hey, so good to hear from you, Adam. I'm about to walk into this thing. Is it okay if I call you back later? Oh, is something urgent? Are you okay? And you say, oh, yeah, everything's fine. Just was thinking about you. Want to catch up? Oh, great. I'll call you later. It takes 10 seconds, right? But it feels very, very different. Because as human beings over thousands of years, we evolved to process all of that other input. Not just the content, again, but the sound of their voice, the tones, the moments of silence, all of that. And so we get a lot out of simply picking up the phone. And that's why also when I try to call somebody and I can't get them, I do another old school thing, which is I actually leave them a voice message. Or sometimes I actually will send them a voice memo instead of texting them. And I did that because I learned that from friends of mine who used to do that. And I was like, wow, it's really nice to hear their voice. The last thing I'll share with you, and there are actually many simple strategies like this, is I try to find one small thing I can do each day to help somebody else. It could be super small. It could be somebody is lost, on the street, and I give them directions. Or I'm on a plane and somebody's having trouble getting their bag up, into the overhead compartment, and I maybe give them a lift. It could be something super small, but it turns out service is one of the most powerful antidotes to loneliness. When we serve other people, we not only feel connected to them in the moment, but we actually remind ourselves that we have value to bring to the world. And that is something that we lose when we struggle with chronic loneliness. We start to believe over time that we're lonely because we deserve it, because we're not likable, we're not lovable. And that can be a downward spiral for people, because the more you feel that, the harder it is to reach out to other people. And service can help break that cycle. So those are some things that I do.
There's so much, I think, valuable to work with in there. And maybe just to elaborate on a couple of the points. First of all, my read of the research on pro-social behavior and helpfulness and its effects on well-being suggests that it's about as effective as taking anti-anxiety and antidepressants. Now, this is not, by the way, a substitute in any way, shape, or form. Let's be clear about that, right? But I think that really helps us calibrate how powerful it is to know that we matter to other people. To your point about social skills being like muscles, I'm thinking about some of the evidence on prisoners who go to solitary confinement and also astronauts in remote environments on the space station, and how the muscle metaphor may actually understate the effect. Because it's not just that you lose the strength, it's also you forget how to do it.
Yes.
And I'd love to talk a little bit about how do we warm up these connections that a lot of people are struggling with. One of the ways I've tried to do this in the classroom, I think you know this exercise from Jane Dutton, where she says, okay, I want you to create a rapid, high-quality connection with a stranger in the room. Actually, you know what? Let's do this live. I want to give you all a chance to experience it before we talk about it. So I want you to turn to someone you don't know. You have 60 seconds to try to make a meaningful connection with them. Go.
I love that. This is great.
To be continued. All right. I hate to cut this off. Sincere apologies for interrupting all of you, but what I think is so interesting is how nervous people would be if this was an assignment for tomorrow, but how natural it is when we ask people to do it right away. And if we go around the room, I'm sure we'll see some common patterns. So how many people, instead of asking, what do you do, asked a version of what do you love to do? Okay, a few of you, or got to a passion. Okay, how many people went to self-disclosure and shared something a little bit vulnerable? Okay, how many people looked for a commonality? Something similar, ideally an uncommon commonality, something you share that's rare. Okay, so there are a lot of these strategies that are pretty intuitive, and it's not until you're forced to use them that you remember, oh, I actually do have those skills. So that's one of my favorite attempts to get people sort of back in the groove. What else do you recommend?
Well, so I think those are very powerful. And the other thing I would just consider, and I know sometimes this can feel scary, but in terms of you sharing, right? I mean, like there are a few elements of connection that make it really effective. One is like when you're able to share honestly and openly. The second is when you're able to listen deeply and meaningfully. And the third is when you're able to ask questions that actually prompt and create the space for somebody else to go deeper, about something that matters to them. And those three things I think are really vital elements, of conversation. And they can feel scary sometimes to do because you might think, well, I'm just here and people want to have a good time. I don't want to ask about they probably want to hear something like deep or heavy from me. They probably don't want to answer questions about that. But when you understand just how many people are hungry for human connection, deeply hungry for it, I hope it will remind you that in the same way that you want that, likely chances are very high that the person that you're about to encounter, whether it's somebody sitting next to you in a bus or a classmate who you haven't met before who's sitting next to you in the cafeteria, that they are also looking for that kind of connection. So life is short. These conversations can make a big difference. And asking meaningful questions, listening deeply to people's answers is so powerful. The listening thing in particular, because listening is how we help people feel seen and understood and heard. It's how we tell people we respect them. And right now, there are a lot of people who feel invisible, who don't feel like respected in the world. And this is I think we're brought up in a culture that often says we've got to talk. That's how we add value to the world. But a lot of times it's through our listening that we could add tremendous value as well.
Sorry, what were you saying? couldn't resist. I guess confession, as a shy introvert, I've hated small talk my whole life. And I've always wanted to jump to meaningful discussion right away, and sometimes that's really jarring or off-putting to people. And then I read this research by Nick Epley and colleagues, which showed that most people actually want to go to deep talk and are not that excited to chat about the weather, or the Sixers game, unless they really think that that Maxey and Embiid got screwed, which they did because we were up by 5 with 27 seconds left. But that's another conversation. But if there's no real emotion attached, right? People want to get to something of real consequence. How do you think about getting there? Because there is that sort of, it feels like you're jumping off a cliff a little bit, and you don't know if the other person's going to have a parachute.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, sometimes I think in a conversation you have to feel this out a little bit. But sometimes if you share first, more openly and authentically, the other person will take a cue from that. Say, okay, maybe it's okay for me to share as well. Versus when you just immediately go in and ask them a question that demands vulnerability from them, if you haven't established that vulnerability is okay in your conversation, they might find that a little hard to do. So sometimes us just sharing and leading by example can actually be just a simple but powerful way to open up that conversation. I
like that. My favorite one so far has been just asking, what's your most uncomfortable small talk conversation you've ever had? Which kind of makes the point in a meta way, and then sometimes that leads somewhere entertaining, and other times it just leads to very awkward small talk about small talk. So you win some, you lose some. Let's talk a little bit about some of the policy perspectives, because I imagine some of this could be relevant at the school level. I know in the UK, social prescribing has become popular. Curious to hear your thoughts about that, but also what should we be thinking about as a faculty, as administration, as student leaders as well, that we can do at a collective level?
Well, I think from a policy perspective, we talked about individual things, we talked about what institutions can do, but we have a broader challenge of needing to rebuild social infrastructure in our communities. we're used to thinking about infrastructure in the sense of highways and bridges and roads and sidewalks. But social infrastructure, these are the structures and programs and policies that actually help us foster healthy relationships, right? Like when you have a community that's cut up by highways with no public transport system, it makes it harder for people to see each other. When you don't have safe spaces for people to gather, it makes it harder for people to have unplanned interactions, for parents to encounter one another at a park that may be in their neighborhood, for example. So the sort of built infrastructure of our communities really matters, and we historically have not focused as much on that as a place to optimize connection. But the second thing that really matters from a policy perspective is our investment in the organizations that typically have brought us together, but we've seen a decline in participation in over the last 60 years. And those include service organizations, recreational leagues, even our faith institutions, which all of these used to be powerful sources of community for people. But participation in all of them has declined, over time. And we need to rebuild many of those. And that can be something that we do with both public and private investment. The other thing that I would just say on the policy front, when you think about what we can do in institutions, in terms of institutional policy, and this actually applies to government as well, is that we have also a broad data collection issue. And I know data, everyone's snoozes when we talk about data, it's like nerdy, whatever. But the problem is data is is what allows us to see what's happening, right? And in medicine, I know there's a version of this in business school, we always learn that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, right? And that's told in grad schools across the country in various professions. But it actually is really true, right? So we've been flying blind for many years on the issue of loneliness and isolation because we haven't prioritized that in terms of data collection. And that's something that we can change now. But this is true at an institutional level as well. So for example, one thing you could do at a place like Wharton is among the metrics of well-being that you track for students and for faculty, you can actually include metrics around loneliness and isolation. The good news is there are validated scales that one can use. And so from a research perspective, there are tools there. You don't have to invent them on your own. And that actually helps tremendously to help us understand, one, how bad is it, and who is most at risk, where we need to intervene. One of the large public universities that I just visited, and I just finished doing a college tour on the subject of loneliness and isolation, where we visited big schools, small schools all across the country. And one of the large universities out west did a survey of their students actually before we came. And they said, yeah, we think loneliness might be an issue here. We're not sure how much. Maybe it's a third of the students are struggling with it, maybe a quarter. We're not sure. Their survey came back showing that 80% of their students said that they were struggling with loneliness and isolation. They were stunned by those numbers. Another university we went to found that 93% of the students who were seeking mental health care services at the university were citing loneliness and isolation as reasons why they were seeking those services, right? So when you start to measure and understand this, that's when you get the full extent of what's happening and understand where to target your interventions. But I think then you also have to evaluate your interventions, right? So there are various things that we could do. Like many universities I talked to have said, well, we tried to build spaces for people to gather, but that didn't seem to solve the problem. And it's because it was necessary but insufficient, right? Because what they were dealing with was something that Adam alluded to, which was not just a lack of place to gather and time to gather, but a lack of comfort and skill with gathering. And those skills and comfort had atrophied and dwindled over the course of the pandemic. So then the question is how to build that up. At another university we went to, they said they found that the problem had gotten so bad in terms of comfort and skills that roommates, the incoming freshmen, were actually not able to have conversations with their roommates about things like, hey, I get up early, you get up late. What do we do about the alarm clock? I'm messy, you're neat. How are we going to handle that? You like to have guests over. I don't. I'm an introvert. What should we do? Those basic conversations, which many roommates have had over generations, right? There wasn't comfort there. So they found themselves having to actually do sessions with students to train them on how do you have this conversation with your roommate. And that might seem peculiar to some of you, maybe who have been through college some years ago, or maybe went through that experience and didn't have a problem. But it is actually quite common, for many college students now. So these are some things I think we need to do in terms of building programs. We've got to collect the data, we've got to build interventions, and we've got to study those interventions to see what works. I think the social prescribing that we're seeing in the UK, and just to describe what that is, that's essentially the practice of if you go to see a doctor, the doctor will screen you for loneliness and isolation. If they recognize you're somebody who's struggling with either one of those, then they will refer you to somebody, just like they would like refer you to a heart specialist or kidney specialist. But this person is actually connected to community resources and organizations, and they can then facilitate a connection between the patient and an organization that can help them build community. So let's say the person loves to do dance. They may help them join an organization in the community that puts on dance performances. Or let's say they like to do art, or they like to be part of a book club. So they help facilitate that connection. So it's not all in the healthcare system to do it, but the healthcare system can help identify people at risk. So those are some, I think social prescribing is really powerful. I think the data has, the devil is in the details of how it's implemented, right? And this is why us studying these outcomes and different program designs is really going to be critical to ensuring that we have a design that actually does help people to reduce loneliness and isolation.
Our dear colleague Sigal Barsaid found in her research on loneliness that in the workplace, if you wanted to avoid loneliness, she was curious about how many friends you needed. And she collected guesses, and a lot of people said 20, 30, 6, 7. And as you know, she found it was only one. You just needed one friend at work.
Yeah.
And I imagine the same is true on campus. But our classes are very busy. It's hard to make friends in class. And then I think, okay, well, clubs are the place we would go. But I've heard over and over from students that they're members of 19 clubs on average, and they don't go to any of them, and that they're more resume builders than community builders. I'd just love to hear you riff on that a little bit. Should we be joining fewer clubs? Should we have a limit to the number of clubs that students can join on campus so that if your max is 2 or 3, you pick the ones that are truly meaningful to you and you attend? How would you think about this problem?
Well, I think quality matters much more than quantity when it comes to addressing loneliness. You don't need 100 friends, but I think what has happened in a digital age is that we somehow ended up replacing our friends with followers, our confidants with contacts, and all of a sudden the quantity became really important, right? But the truth is, like, you may have like 1,000 contacts, on social media, but the real question is at 3 a.m. when you get up and are in crisis, like, are you calling one of those contacts? Can you be yourself with them? Can you be vulnerable and truly who you are? That's the real question. And you only need 1 or 2 people like that, like in your life. So again, quality really matters a lot. But I think given that we're in a world that's constantly pulling us in the quantity direction, I do think it's important for us to be judicious with our time. I think, look, joining 19 clubs, the likelihood is that you're probably not getting a lot out of all of them, right? There might be a few, though, that you're getting something out of. And so it's worth thinking, okay, how do I focus on just those, right? And how do I actually get to know the people in that club? How do we get to know each other? How do we do things in our community together? How do we serve other people? Recognizing service, again, powerful antidote to loneliness. If you can do that in 1 or 2 clubs, you can make a huge, huge difference, right? But, I've been part of that experience of like being a member of like a gajillion clubs, and I can't even tell you which clubs I was a part of, like in college, because most of them were not meaningful to me. They didn't change my life. Turned out I don't think they helped me much for my career either, or my next step. So I just think, look, the one thing we can't get back in our life is time, right? And it's worth, especially in this moment, like asking ourselves, are we putting our time in the clubs, in the relationships that truly matter to us? As an introvert also, like you, Adam, like I remember like freshman year of college, orientation was super or extroverted, right? In terms of how it was designed, right? And it was
hated every minute of it.
Yeah, so did I. It just didn't quite gel. But it felt like if you weren't going to like the big ice cream social, if you weren't going to the big nighttime mixer or whatever, then you were a loser, right? And I just wanted to like sit down with 1 or 2 people and have like a long conversation, but that was just a little odd. But what I would say is this is like the moment to just put those stereotypes and cultural norms aside and say, in a world where truly we've learned, especially through COVID, that quality of relationships matter. Who are the 1 or 2 people that you'd really want to spend time with, that you'd want to really get to know? Like, what can you do today when you leave here to actually start down the road of building a deeper relationship with them? Maybe it's messaging one of them saying, hey, can we get lunch next week? I would love to just sit down and chat, the 2 of us. There's a simple thing I used to do, which when I was in medical school, I started medical school and I didn't know anybody who was in the class. I was in a new town. I didn't know any, I had no community, but I was also really introverted, and I was worried about the same thing that happened in college happening in med school, which was like I wouldn't feel comfortable with all these mixers. So what I did is And I also knew everyone was busy, right? They were taking 15,000 classes, this and that and the other. So I just said, you know what? Everyone has lunch. So here's what I'm going to do. At lunchtime, I'm just going to have lunch one-on-one with somebody a few times a week, right? A different person. But this is how I'll get to know my classmates. I'll just have lunch, one-on-one with different people. And so it was a little hard to do in the beginning. I was a little nervous. I was like, well, what if they say, like, I don't want to have lunch with you. I don't even know you, But I found that, apropos to what we were saying earlier, that everyone else was also really hungry for connection. And so when I said, hey, do you want to have lunch tomorrow or next week? They're like, sure, yeah, why not? And I built some of the closest friendships I had, like in medical school, through those one-on-one lunches. And it became clear to me later on in that year of my first year, after doing this maybe 40 times or so, people then started saying, hey, people I didn't know would come up to me and say, hey, is it time for my one-on-one? Are we going to have lunch together at some point? And what I realized through that is many of them were not finding that just the large group gatherings were actually facilitating the kind of depth of relationships and conversation that they really wanted. So don't hesitate to go smaller, but think about who those one or two people are and what you could do seriously when you leave here to see them again, to have like a meaningful conversation with them, because those relationships that you build during this time in school, I mean, you hear those cliches are right, that the meaningful relationships you build here truly can last for a lifetime. They can be deeply meaningful to you. And Sigal Barsaid, finally, who Adam mentioned, she, many of you may know her. She passed recently. She was a professor here at Wharton. But before she was at Wharton, she was a professor at Yale at the School of Management. And that's actually where I was her student when I was in business school. And so much of what she taught us in our organizational behavior class, it was about a lot of different things that you would not find surprising in the curriculum. But the unsaid part of the curriculum was that she fundamentally taught us about building relationships, about how to communicate with other people, how to build trust, and about the incredible value of doing that, not just in the workplace, but outside it as well.
You're also reminding me of an alum of ours, Serena, who went on to work with you, who, when she was here to build community, she would organize little dinners and invite 2 or 3 people she knew and ask them each to bring one person she didn't know. And she would rotate the people from week to week. And I thought it was a wonderful way of bringing people together who weren't already connected. Yeah. All right, let's go to a lightning round. I want to make sure we get to some questions that were submitted by some of our attendees. Worst career advice you've ever gotten?
Worst career advice I ever got was to not take risk because it would close off career opportunities for me. I was told this in medicine. I was told, hey, if you go off and take a year off and try all these new things, and then you later want to go back and do a fellowship, go back on the same path that you were on, in academia or otherwise, that people won't think you're serious. So don't get off the track because you won't be able to get back on. That was terrible advice. Yeah.
All right. What about, this is also fun. You mentioned that you did an MBA. What was the biggest mistake you made in business school?
Oh, wow. Biggest mistake. I would actually say the biggest mistake I made was actually not spending more time just hanging out with my classmates. It took me probably a good year. I mean, I got into business school. I was like, this is a new world to me. And I was like very studious like the first year. To all the faculty, I'm not saying people shouldn't be studious in business school. Please study hard, learn the material. Curriculum is good. But what I realized I was not doing enough of was actually getting to know people. And business school is actually different from medical school in so many ways, but the just diversity of experiences that people came with, people from all over the world, it was phenomenal. And so I finally started doing that my second year, but I wish I had done it earlier.
Do you have a favorite tip for fighting burnout? It's been another one of your favorite mental health topics.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite tip for fighting burnout is to find reasons to laugh. Laughter is so powerful. I had a series of funny shows that I would and video clips that I actually keep in my toolbox when I need to feel joy or inspiration. And when I was starting to feel burned out during my first term as Surgeon General, I would come home and I would dip into that toolbox. And so whether it's people, whether it's a funny experience, a video, a show, something that makes you laugh, that's important for us to keep laughing if we want to stay on the path and not burn out.
Let the record show that the Surgeon General who issued an advisory last year about social media is recommending YouTube as a cure for burnout. I have to ask a follow-up on that. What are your favorite shows that you laugh at?
So um, so there's a lot of old West Wing episodes that I really like. For those of you like the West Wing, dialogue is very, very witty. Aaron Sorkin's a genius. So a lot of those I really like. And then there are other shows or movies that I just have found deeply inspiring, especially sports movies. So Miracle, like the movie about the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team, one of my all-time favorites. Glory Road, which is about I believe it was 1968 or 64, Texas Western basketball team, college basketball team, first all-black team that was fielded, and they actually won the national championship. Sorry for the spoiler. But anyway, those are some of the things that I look for, and I'm a big speech junkie, so I will generally look for to inspiring speeches. There, like MLK's final speech that he gave before he was assassinated always still gives me chills to this day. There are many like that, that RFK in particular. Oh my gosh, so many beautiful, inspiring speeches of his that they don't just make me feel better, but they remind me what matters, which is that it's our connection to each other, but also our commitment to one another, to society, that can often be the greatest source of fulfillment and joy. Can I say, we were talking about success?
No, you can't. Do it.
Okay.
Go for it.
This is one of the things actually that I've been thinking about a lot and has worried me. I do think that there's a story we've been telling ourselves for years now in society, which is that we want to be successful because if we're successful, we'll be fulfilled. But what society keeps telling us is that to be successful, we've got to build our resume, we've got to build our contacts, we've got to essentially find some way to become rich, to become powerful, or to become famous. And gosh, if we do all three of those things, we've hit the jackpot. We've done it. But I think it has become increasingly clear through both empirical evidence and stories and data that there's nothing wrong with pursuing fame or fortune or power, but on their own, they actually aren't reliable paths to fulfillment and to happiness and to well-being. Adam and I'm sure, and many of you as well, probably know plenty of people who are rich or powerful or famous and profoundly unhappy. It turns out there's another trio that's actually, I think science tells us much more clearly, is the path to fulfillment. And that is belonging, purpose, and service. The common thread between these three is they involve connecting with something bigger than ourselves. And that turns out to be a very consistent and enduring theme. Whether you're looking at the research, if you're a religious person, you look at scripture, you'll find this theme running through scripture as well in different faith traditions. You'll find philosophers writing about this over 1,000+ years. But there's a lot of life experience and data that tells us that when we have a sense of belonging, when we're connected to people, it can just be a few, when we have a sense of purpose, when we feel like there's something that gives us joy that we can delve into that will help contribute something to the world. And when we are involved in acts of service, however small or big they may be, these three turn out to be really enduring paths to fulfillment. And I say this, because I've also seen this through my conversations with patients over the years. One of the great privileges and that I have, good fortunes, if you will, in being a doctor has been over the years I've been able to sit with people at some of the most meaningful moments of their life when they're reflecting deeply on the life they've lived and asking themselves, what really mattered in what I did over the last 20, 40, 60, or 80 years. And this story that they tell very, very consistently is that of connections to other people, to relationships. That's the story that they talk about. They tell the story of what they contributed to their community, to the lives of other people. Like in the end, it becomes very clear that it's our relationships and our service to the world that are our greatest source of joy. None of those conversations I've had with patients in their dying days, when I've been privileged to sit there by their bedside and hold their hand as they reflected, none of those conversations have centered around them reflecting on how many followers they had on Instagram, or how much money was in their bank account, or which award they got, at the last, gathering of XYZ association. They all talk about people. They all talk about the contributions they were able to make to people's lives. And so I just don't want any of us, to feel like we have to wait till the end of our life to discover that. We can start living that kind of life right now and recognizing that if we put at the center of our lives, if we use as our fundamental compass the pursuit of connection, of relationships, purpose, and service, that will guide us toward a life that will be fulfilling. It may not be an easy life, it may not always be a simple life. It will have its ups and downs, but fundamentally, it'll be a life that we can look back on and say, that was a life well lived.
You've mentioned followers a few times, so I have to ask one of the social media questions in here, which is, it seems to be a tightrope walk between protecting especially young adults and kids, and on the other hand, enabling people to make their own choices. How do you think about managing that line, and what kinds of protections do you think we need?
Yeah. Sorry. I've done the wrong way. I think, look, I think that, as somebody who's spent many years building a tech company, I'm a believer in technology. I think it can improve our lives in profound ways. But I think what determines whether or not tech helps or hurts us is how it's designed and how it's used. And my big worry about social media in particular, and I say this as somebody who for many years, has used social media, is that I think particularly for kids, for adolescents especially, that I do worry that many of them have actually been harmed by the use of social media. And this is actually why we put out a report on this last year, because the most common question I was getting from parents was about whether social media was safe for their kids. It's a very reasonable question if you're a parent, right? We ask about whether the food that we buy, the toys we buy, the car seat we buy is safe for our kids. Why wouldn't we ask about this product that they're using actually much more than any of those in terms of sheer amount of time? And the conclusion that we came to after looking at the research and talking to experts around the country and around the world really was twofold. One is that there actually isn't enough evidence that tells us that it's safe. And in fact, there's growing evidence that points toward harms, right? Specifically, we were seeing this powerful association between increased risk of depression and anxiety symptoms. Young people were telling us directly on surveys, nearly half of them, that using social media made them feel worse about their body image. We were seeing also just in terms of time taken away, that there was a massive substitution that was taking place in terms of time spent on social media was time that was not spent in person with other people. It was time that was not spent sleeping. Many kids were staying, about a third of adolescents were saying they were staying up till midnight or later on weeknights, using their devices, and much of that was actually social media use. The problem with all of this is that we might think, well, this is just a willpower issue. People should be able to control and regulate how much time they spend. That sounds good in theory, right? But what's happening is that these platforms are designed by some of the best product engineers in the world with some of the best behavioral science, at their fingertips. And it's designed to maximize how much time we spend on them, right? That's what the revenue model is based on. And you're asking a child who's 13, 14 years old, at one of the most sensitive times of their brain's development, where we know that in that phase of brain development, they're especially sensitive to social suggestion and social comparison and have difficulty with impulse control. And you're asking that child to somehow manage something that, frankly, most of us as adults struggle to do, right? That is a recipe for disaster. And I think it has sadly become one of, not the only, but one of the major contributors to the youth mental health crisis that we're dealing with today. So I think we have a few paths forward that we could take. In my mind, the most expedient thing to do would be to do what we do with other products that kids use, which is to say we have to make these safe for kids, and we have to demand the data that tells us that this is in fact safe for kids. But in a very peculiar turn of events, it turns out that researchers can't get full access to that data because the companies actually won't give it to them. Now, if you're a parent, and some of you may be parents, and I'll say this as a parent myself, Adam, I know you're a parent, it doesn't feel good to know that something your kids are using, that there's data about its effects on their mental health, but that's not being shared with you, not being made available to the public, right? So that's very concerning to me, because we don't tolerate that with many other products that kids use. So I think, number one, we need data transparency. Number two, we need to actually put in place safety standards, like what we did for cars, where we, in the 1980s, like when I was growing up, there was a pretty high rate of car accident-related deaths. And we didn't say at that time, you know what, it's just a price of modernity. This is just how it goes. We just got to tolerate all these deaths so that people can get from their home to McDonald's faster, right? We didn't say that, right? We said, but we also didn't say, you know what, let's go back to horses and buggies because this car thing's not working out. We said, we have to make cars safer. That was the path we said we had to go down. And then we did it. Over years, we put in place safety standards that got us seatbelts and airbags and crash testing and a host of other measures that ultimately brought down the rate of car accident-related deaths. But right now, what we're doing is essentially, with social media and kids, is we're putting them in cars that have no safety features functionally, and we're asking them to drive on roads with no speed limits, no lanes, and no traffic lights. And we're saying, hopefully you'll figure it out. Hopefully we'll get there. And that is just, in my mind, just a completely unacceptable and also unnecessary approach to take. But it will take some courage to actually to put these safety standards in place to require this kind of data transparency. And this is a place where I think Congress actually really does need to act. Many states on their own are trying to put in place their own version of safety standards. Some are not sure how to do it, are just saying, you know what, we have to just restrict kids and from using this or ban them from using it below a certain age. And I can understand why states are taking these different approaches. But this is a place where you actually do need a comprehensive solution. I'm generally pretty selective about where I think the federal government should put in place rules and policies, because you can't be too overzealous about that. This is one of those places where you actually do need uniformity. And I think the fact that social media has been around for 20 years, and we have not as a society put in place any meaningful safety standards and enforced them, to me is just a dereliction of duty. And it's a failure from Congress, and it represents, I think, ultimately a failure to abide by one of our most important responsibilities as a society, which is to take care of our kids. Because if we're not doing that, like, what are we doing? Like, what else is worthwhile if we're not fundamentally taking care of our children? And that's what we've got to do. And that's what I called for actually in our advisory last year, and what we're continuing to push Congress to do.
That's very well put. One more tech question before a closing question. There are a lot of people curious about AI in the room, and in particular, preventative medicine. Where are you on how much we should be worried about AI in the world of healthcare versus excited about its potential, and what do you see coming around the corner?
Well, I'm actually both excited and worried about AI, and I think it's appropriate to be both, because I think, like any other technology, like we were saying, there is great benefit that could come from it. When you think about healthcare in particular, since that's what you're asking about, Adam, I think, look, AI has a potential to help us aggregate and sift through and process knowledge that we know has expanded massively, scientific knowledge, medical knowledge, but that is hard for a single individual to process or have their fingertips in at any given point in time. That is valuable. AI has the potential to help streamline many of the administrative tasks that nurses and doctors are spending their time doing, instead of being at the bedside with patients, which is where they want to be and where patients want them to be, right? And I think from a preventive standpoint also, I do think that AI can make it more feasible and possible for us to also more effectively identify who is at risk in our communities, right? So that we can better target our interventions, so that we can prevent cases of diabetes, so we can get to people who may be at risk of cancer and prevent them from being found in late stages, of cancer. Like, I think in all of those ways, AI could be really powerful. I think the thing that we have to guard against, though, and this is important to do early, especially given some of the failure to do so with social media, what we've learned from that, is we've got to make sure, number one, that we aren't compromising people's privacy in the process, right? And that is a big concern right now. The second thing we have to also ensure is that we still recognize the important role of human beings in the process of delivering healthcare. Look, I'm a believer in tech, but I also don't believe that a machine can hold your hand at the bedside and listen to your story and understand its significance and relevance and empathize and connect with you the way I believe only two human beings can do. And that is not something I think that we should lose sight of, because that is the part of healing that my parents taught me about in my earliest days. It's what they modeled so beautifully and so clearly. But I think that, again, to learn from our experience with social media, if we don't have these conversations now, if we don't establish the kind of safeguards and guardrails that we need around AI to assume that we're protecting privacy, we're protecting what I mentioned, the human role, of nurses, doctors, and others in the healthcare system, then I worry that the pendulum will swing to one extreme, and one day we'll wake up and realize, wait, hold on, I'm not fully happy with all of my care being provided by a machine that doesn't really know me as a human being that I can't really see face to face, whose hand I can't shake, that just doesn't feel quite right. There's something powerful about human to human connection that we began this whole conversation with, talking about the power of human connection. We can't get that lost in the race to make sure we benefit from the strong points and high points of AI.
Okay, final question.
Yeah.
There are some people in the room who are curious about careers in public service, and even those who aren't are always fascinated by what it's really like to be in the White House and how real the West Wing is. So I wanted to ask you if you could give us a story that would maybe illustrate what your life is like. And I think everyone I know who worked in the Obama administration has a favorite Obama story. So I'll turn it over to you to choose.
Oh, so favorite story from the White House, huh? Is that what you're asking? I mean, the one of the things that I try to do is, every time I'm there, any part of the White House, the West Wing in particular, whether it's walking to our office there, whether it's just going there for a meeting, is there's a for any of you who've been to the White House, you know that there's the white building that everyone knows as the White House, and then there's a building right next to it that's part of the White House complex called the EEOB, or the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. And I always like to stand on the top steps of the EEOB, where you exit at the east entrance or exit. It's called the Navy Steps. And if you stand at the top of the Navy Steps, you actually look out and see the entire White House. You see the south, some parts of the South Lawn. You see the North Lawn. It's just this beautiful, beautiful spectacle. And I like to do that because it's sort of a moment for me to remember not to take that place for granted, not to take the opportunity to serve in government and to be in a place like that, not to take that for granted. Because when my parents came to the United States, they came from India because they wanted to build a life for their kids where we wouldn't be judged by our caste or the color of our skin or the fact that we had a funny sounding name or we had a funny accent. They wanted us to live in a place where we would have opportunities, where we would, yes, work hard, but where we'd be judged by our ideas, by our willingness to contribute and be a part of a community. And they were clear-eyed about the fact that America didn't execute on that all the time. They were clear about the fact that there were imperfections, that those were aspirational values. But they wanted to live in a country, they wanted their kids to grow up in a country that aspired to those values and worked hard every day to make them a reality for everyone. And with all of those high hopes that they came with, they never dreamed that their son would have the chance to serve in government, much less to work in or walk through like a place like the White House, or that he would have the chance to sit with and advise the president. That was beyond even their comprehension. But I remember when I was sworn in that first time, I was actually he was Vice President Biden, who actually swore me in for the role during the Obama administration. I remember thinking and saying to the friends and family who would gather that there are a few places in the world where the son of a poor farmer from India could be asked by the president to look out for the health of an entire nation. That's the power and the promise of America. It's something I will always be grateful for, and it's what I remember every time I stand on the top of those Navy steps. Whenever we go with our staff, whenever my team members are there, I'll also often make them stand there too on our way out, and just to take a deep breath, to look out at everything and to remember their family, to remember their journey that brought them to that moment. Last thing I'll tell you on this is that it's a very, I know sometimes you look at a place like that from the outside and it feels like it's probably hard to relate to, otherworldly, whatever, but it's actually very relational as well. A lot of the same dynamics that you deal with in your relationships with faculty, with friends, with classmates, a lot of those human dynamics are playing out there too. There are passionate people who really want to make a difference in the world and who are working through all the challenges of being human beings and trying to do that, how to communicate with each other, work with each other. But I do appreciate the fact that there are so many fundamentally mission-driven people there. A lot of the folks who I work with there, they could be making 3x the salary they're making working in the private sector. But working in the public sector was a choice for them because there was something, usually something in their life experience that happened. Somebody who was hurt, somebody who was not served, a promise that was not fulfilled, something that inspired them to want to come and make the country better for everyone in that regard. And one of the people who actually represents that a lot for me, just on a very personal level, is actually the president himself. I got to know him in particular during the pandemic, before he was president, when he had reached out, with his team in March of 2020 and asked, he and I had worked together a little bit in the Obama administration, but they'd asked in March of 2020, for me to sort of do these daily briefings for him, like on COVID, because it was rapidly evolving. The whole world was changing at that time. He was deeply concerned and wanted to understand the intricacies of how this was evolving. So that started this process of doing these daily briefings with him. And it was nuts. I mean, they were sometimes 90 minutes long. I was up till 4 a.m. preparing for them, because you literally have to boil the whole ocean of everything that was happening in the world on COVID and figure out what does this man, who may be the next president of the United States, need to understand, about this evolving pandemic. That, by the way, hey, we in the medical and public health establishment barely understand either. This is evolving before our eyes. And I was doing this, thankfully, in partnership with David Kessler, who used to be the FDA commissioner, and in a funny twist of fate, was actually my dean when I was in medical school. And this is what brought us back together again. But the thing that I got to know about him, there's a lot about him that I got to know, but the piece that I really hold closest to my heart is just how deeply he cared about people. And that became very evident in our early conversations. It didn't matter. Usually it was when no cameras around, no one's paying attention. It's he's fundamentally a very relational person. And that way he reminds me of my mom and dad and how they took care of patients, that they just cared about the person. They wanted to know about the person and how they were doing. I was briefing him one day, and my son and daughter burst into the room. They were, I think, 4 and 5 at the time, 3 and 4. They burst into the room, were screaming, right? It was I couldn't talk over it. It was so loud, but he was just so kind. He was like, "They're kids. Let them do what they're doing. It's fine. Don't worry about it." Another time I was briefing him in his office after he was president in the Oval Office about some COVID-related things. And after the briefing finished, I just stayed afterward just to talk to him a few minutes, check in on him. And I was just telling him, I was like, "Hey, your buddy's at home," because my kids call him Uncle Joe. That's their term they have for him. And they call the First Lady Auntie Jill. So that's how they know them. I'm not even sure if they know their president. He's the president, but they just call him Uncle Joe. But I said, "Oh, your fans were asking about you." He's like, "Oh, really? Well, what are they doing? Can I talk to them right now?" I was like, I'm looking at his staff right outside the door, outside the Oval Office, being like, "We gotta get him to the next thing. He's late for something." And he's like, let me call him. Let me call him right now." And he literally takes out his phone. And he's like, "Here, let me just give me the number. Let me call them." And he spent the time to make a phone call, to talk to my family. It's I've seen him just even when other visitors come, he'll spend so much time just showing them around and learning about them and asking about their family. And whenever I have time to spend with him, it's just a reminder to me of actually exactly what we've been talking about this entire past hour, which is that at the end of the day, in the final moments of our life, what really matters are the people in our life, the relationships we hold. And every time he, in the middle of a meeting, will pick up a phone call because it's a family member calling, and he's a commitment ironclad is always be there for his family. Every time I see him asking about my family, or about somebody else's family who he works with, even though he's jam-packed with meetings, it's a reminder to me that life is busy, life is crazy, life is complicated. But if we keep at the center of our hearts, and if we keep clear in our mind's eye, the fact that our relationships are our greatest source of fulfillment, that those are the ones that we need to hold and protect and keep close, that we need to invest in, that those are the people who will be there for us no matter what. If we do that, then we have a really good shot of leading a fulfilling and happy life. Look, I know we're over time, so I want to leave you just with one thing I do, actually, to remind myself of this, when things get rough, or when I feel like I'm being pulled into the vortex of caring, more than I should about some of those other pieces that we talked about, And so it just takes, this is a 20-second exercise that I do, but I'll ask you to do it with me. So I want you to hold up your right hand. I want you to place it over your heart. And I want you to close your eyes. And for the next few moments, I want you to think about the people in your life who have been there for you during good times and bad times. people who have supported you, who have been there when you weren't even sure if you believed in yourself, people who reminded you that you mattered, that they still cared for you. I want you to feel their warmth and their love flowing through you, filling your heart and filling you with peace. And I want you to know that that love, that warmth is always there, even if they're not here with you anymore, because it resides in your heart. Now open your eyes. What we all felt in those brief moments was the power of human connection. We felt the power of love. And that is something that we can cultivate each and every day in our life. Something that we can hold close and keep at the center of the lives that we live going forward. I know that the world around us is telling us that we need to live a work-centered life. But living a people-centered life, where we prioritize our relationships, that actually not only makes us more fulfilled, it often helps us do our work better as well. And so that's my hope for you, leaving today, is that there's something in this conversation, something in your own reflections, something in the conversation you had with the person next to you that will remind you of the power of living a people-centered life, and that will remind you that you have the capacity to give and receive the love that is at the heart of building those relationships. So let's build them, let's enjoy them, and let's ultimately benefit from the fulfillment that comes from them.
Vivek, grateful that you were willing to come and join us today. Grateful that you made the choice to serve. I can't think of a better person to be looking out for our well-being. And I just want to say thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam.